Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Mercer saw when he looked at her. That's what everyone at Cedar Creek Medical saw when Brooke Sullivan moved through the ER in her crisp navy scrubs, her eyes always down, her voice always soft, never interrupting, never disagreeing, never drawing a single breath of attention to herself. They didn't know. And they had no idea who was standing in their trauma bays, moving with the precision of someone who had held lives together with her hands in places where the only light came from muzzle flashes. They had no idea that the quiet nurse who kept her locker locked and her jacket always buttoned was a legend erased from every database, a woman whose name had been deleted so thoroughly that even the Pentagon servers had forgotten her. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song over the Cedar Creek ER nurses' station, a sound like 10,000 insects trapped in plastic, antiseptic heavy in the air, cutting through everything else: coffee, sweat, the faint copper undertone of blood from the trauma bay where the morning had already begun. It was 7:43 a.m. on a Tuesday in Raleigh, and Brooke Sullivan stood at the medication cabinet assembling for supplies with her hands moving on their own, muscle memory executing each motion with a kind of precision that comes from having done it 10,000 times in perfect darkness. 14-gauge needle. Draw up the flush. Capital repeat. Her movements were economical, efficient, nothing wasted. She had learned that efficiency kept you alive. The ER hummed around her, stretchers squeaking across tile, the rhythmic wheeze of a ventilator in Bay 3, phones ringing with that particular urgent tone that meant someone's day was about to get worse. Brooke moved through it all like water finding its path around stone, present but not intrusive, helpful but not remarkable. A patient came in at 7:51 with a split laceration on his forearm, and she was there before the attending finished his initial assessment, already reading the wound's depth with her eyes, subcutaneous, possibly involving the flexor carpi radialis. She had the suture kit open, the field prepped, the local anesthetic drawn at exactly the concentration she would have chosen. The attending, Dr. Walsh, barely glanced at her. He saw a competent nurse doing routine work. He didn't see the hands that had performed emergency surgical procedures by flashlight in a military hospital with no power, no anesthesia, nothing but improvisation and will. She sutured 12 stitches, evenly spaced, tension perfect, while her mind was somewhere else entirely, still partially deployed to a place that no longer officially existed on any map. The left lateral thoracotomy she'd performed on a 19-year-old Marine with penetrating chest trauma. The emergency cricothyrotomy through a patient's cricothyroid membrane when the swelling wouldn't stop. The femoral artery clamping with equipment that wasn't designed for the job but worked anyway because it had to. Her hands knew these things. Her hands would always know these things. But the world she lived in now, the ER of Cedar Creek Medical with its bright lights and clean tile and protocols that stretched for pages in binders on shelves, this world required those hands to forget. At 8:17, she was assessing a trauma arrival when she caught herself using command voice. The patient had come in hypotensive, and the junior resident was moving too slowly, his hands hesitating over the supplies. Brooke's voice dropped an octave and hardened into something sharp as a scalpel. 14-gauge, left antecubital, now. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The resident's eyes snapped to hers, startled by the absolute authority in those 3 words, and he moved, actually moved with purpose for the first time since she'd been watching him. She caught herself immediately. Softened her shoulders. Added the apologetic inflection. I mean, if you think that's the best approach, doctor. The moment passed. The resident didn't think twice about it. He was too focused on his patient. But Dr. Mercer saw it. He was standing in the doorway between the ER and the main corridor, his arms crossed, his expression the particular mixture of disdain and calculation that meant he was observing something he didn't like. He was 53 years old, with a kind of expensive watch that cost as much as a car and the kind of haircut that required a stylist who knew his name. He'd been at Cedar Creek for 8 years, long enough to establish himself as the attending who would see you if you could afford private care, the one the hospital administrators deferred to because he brought in revenue and complications were someone else's problem. He'd never bothered to learn the nurses' names. To him, they were interchangeable labor, part of the background scenery of his practice. He'd noticed Brooke Sullivan 3 months ago, not because of anything she'd done, but because of the one thing she hadn't done, she hadn't fawned over him like the others. She didn't laugh at his jokes. She didn't find reasons to brush past him in the hallway. She didn't make eye contact during his explanations. She had instead treated him exactly as she treated every other person in the hospital, with professional courtesy and nothing more. It was a kind of invisibility that made him acutely aware of being invisible to her, and invisibility was something Mercer had never tolerated. For a man accustomed to being the most important person in every room, being irrelevant was a particularly potent form of insult. He'd started watching her 2 weeks ago. Not obviously. But he noticed the way she moved through her shift, the precision with which she placed an 4, never more than one attempt, needle angle perfect, tourniquet release smooth, no fumbling, no hesitation. He noticed the way she read a patient's vitals like someone interpreting intelligence briefings, her eyes moving across the monitors in a pattern that suggested she knew exactly what she was looking for. He noticed the way she de-escalated situations, a confused post-op patient becoming agitated, Brooke sitting beside him, speaking in a voice so low the monitors had to compete with it, and the patient calming within 90 seconds. He noticed the way other nurses came to her with questions they didn't ask the attending physicians. What he didn't know was that Brooke Sullivan, age 29, limp favoring her left leg from a blast concussion that had never been officially documented, hand scarred in places that would never quite match civilian accident patterns, had spent the previous 7 years in a life that didn't exist anymore. That she'd been a captain in the Navy, attached to a SEAL team that specialized in high-risk extractions, operating in theaters so classified that her name had been deleted from every roster, every record, every acknowledgement of her service. That the limp he might have noticed if he'd bothered to observe her walking wasn't from an accident in civilian life, it was from a Black Ops disaster in Bagram, the kind of disaster that resulted in immediate medical evacuation, emergency surgery by combat surgeons, and then orders from the Pentagon that came directly to the hospital, erase Captain Brooke Sullivan. Classify everything. Doctor the records. Issue her a civilian identity and a discharge paperwork that would never hold up under scrutiny if anyone official looked at it. Send her into the world as someone she'd never been, and make sure she stayed invisible. The invisibility was the point. It was the only thing that kept her alive, the only thing that kept the people she'd worked with alive. If she acknowledged who she was, if she let anyone see her, the entire operation unraveled. The people she'd trained with, the medics and operators who were still deployed, the classified missions that were ongoing, all of it depended on her vanishing completely. So she'd taken a civilian nursing job at a hospital that had no connection to military medicine. She'd cut her hair. She'd lowered her voice half an octave permanently. She'd learned to flinch at loud noises like a civilian would flinch. She'd learned to hesitate before making decisions, to ask permission instead of taking action. She'd learned to be small. What she couldn't learn was how to make her hands forget. Your hands don't forget. Your hands remember every single thing they've ever done, every life they've held, every moment they had to be perfect or someone died. So sometimes, under stress, under pressure, in the moment when a patient needed her and the instinct to act overrode the instinct to hide, her hands would speak in a language she couldn't quite suppress. And that was dangerous. At 8:45, during her break, she stood in the locker room alone and touched the patch through the fabric of her jacket. The jacket hung in her locker, carefully positioned, always buttoned, always locked. The patch was sewn deep inside the lining, invisible unless you specifically looked for it. It was a faded unit patch, the colors muted by time and salt water and the particular kind of wear that comes from being worn against skin through 1,000 hours in a combat environment. It showed a raven with wings spread, the symbol of the unit she belonged to for 12 years and 4 months. Sometimes, when she was alone, she would touch it. Just to confirm it was still there. Just to confirm that it had been real. She pressed her palm flat against the fabric, feeling the raised threads of the embroidered raven through the twill. Her other hand, the one with the 3 faint scars on the knuckles from a fight in Helmand Province, curled at her side. Her breathing was steady. Her heartbeat was steady. Everything about her was steady because steadiness was what had kept her alive, and steadiness was what would keep her alive now. The locker room was empty. The ventilator's wheeze filtered through the walls from Bay 3. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor was beeping its insistent rhythm. She withdrew her hand and turned away from the locker, closing the door, spinning the combination lock. When she returned to the floor, she was already diminishing again, already shrinking back down into the role that kept her hidden. The break was over. The shift continued. She was just a nurse. But Dr. Mercer was waiting. He stood at the end of the main corridor, reviewing a patient chart with the expression of someone who had found something interesting, something that required documentation, something that required action. When she passed him, he looked up from the chart, and his eyes tracked her with the particular focus of a predator who has just identified weakness in its prey. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She felt his attention settle on her like a weight, and she understood in that moment that something had changed. He'd seen something in that moment with the trauma patient. He'd seen the command voice. He'd seen the authority. He'd seen something that didn't match the profile of the quiet nurse he decided she was. And now he was going to decide what to do about it. He approached the nurse's station where she was documenting vitals, his footsteps deliberate, his bearing the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no by anyone with the power to enforce it. He set the patient chart down on the counter beside her, positioned so she couldn't avoid seeing it. "Your documentation on the Hendrix intake," he said. His voice was casual. Conversational. Which made it worse. "Need to discuss some concerns." Brooke looked at the chart. Looked up at him. Her face remained neutral. "Of course, doctor." "Later," he said. He was already walking away. "My office. 3 o'clock." She watched him go, then looked back at the chart. She documented everything correctly. Vitals, assessment, interventions, patient response. Everything was precise and within protocol and utterly defensible. Which meant this wasn't about the documentation. This was about the fact that Dr. Mercer had seen something in her, and instead of looking away, he decided to investigate. The next 3 hours passed like they were written in slow motion. Every phone rang too loudly. Every monitor beep was too insistent. Every moment stretched and elongated, giving her time to think about what was happening, what had been set in motion, what it meant that someone had finally noticed the thing she'd spent 7 years trying to hide. At 2:58 p.m., she stood outside his office and knocked on the door. "Come in," he called. When the door opened, she understood that everything was about to change. The amphitheater at Cedar Creek Medical held the weight of 30 faces, all of them turned toward the projection screen where her handwriting filled the space, neat, abbreviated, efficient. Dr. Mercer stood beneath the glowing documentation like a prosecutor holding evidence of a crime, his tailored jacket catching the fluorescent lights in a way that made him look polished, untouchable. Brooke stood in the back row, her hands steady at her sides, her face a mask of professional attention. "This," Mercer said, pointing at her chart notes with the tip of a fountain pen, "is what happens when standards slip. Dangerous incompetence dressed up as efficiency." He turned to face the amphitheater, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had never experienced real consequences. "Note the abbreviated assessments. The lack of clinical depth. This is not medicine. This is cutting corners, and it kills patients." 20 residents shifted in their seats. Someone's pen scratched nervous notes. 3 of them smirked, the way predators recognize weakness in the herd. Brooke's eyes met his across the auditorium. Cold. Flat. The kind of stare that had watched men die in the Panja Valley and registered nothing but data. She didn't blink. She didn't shift her weight. She simply held his gaze until he turned back to the screen, something flickering across his face, annoyance that she hadn't flinched, hadn't flushed red, hadn't given him the satisfaction of visible humiliation. He wanted a reaction. She gave him silence. The grand rounds continued for another 40 minutes. Mercer presented 3 more cases, studiously avoiding her corner of the room, which meant his anger was crystallizing into something sharper than mere condescension. This was deliberate. This was a campaign. Brooke recognized the pattern from Afghanistan, the way enemies probed for weakness before committing to a full assault. She'd learned to breathe through it then. She would breathe through it now. The cafeteria smelled like industrial chicken broth and floor wax at 12:16 p.m., and Brooke was feeding $2 bills into the vending machine when Mercer appeared beside her like something conjured by spite. He didn't acknowledge her presence directly. Instead, he spoke to the empty air, his voice pitched loud enough for the tables behind them to hear. You know, maybe community college nurses should stick to bedpans and sponge baths. Leave the real medicine to people with actual credentials. He turned his head slightly, watching her reaction in the peripheral vision of his arrogance. It's not an insult. It's just knowing your lane. The coffee cup dropped into the dispenser with a mechanical thud. Brooke retrieved it without hurrying, her fingers steady as they gripped the foam rim. She turned to face him directly, and something in the quality of her stillness made a resident at the nearby table look up from his sandwich. When she spoke, her voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It moved through the cafeteria like a surgical instrument cutting through tissue, precise, cold, and leaving a wound that wouldn't close. Strange how your concerns about my competence only started the week after I questioned why we're billing for surgical kits that never left the supply room. The noise in the cafeteria didn't stop, the clatter of trays continued, the fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical hymn, but something had shifted in the pressure of the room. Mercer's face went the color of old snow. His jaw tightened. A vein at his temple began to pulse with something that looked like rage but felt like fear to anyone who understood how power actually worked. You have no idea what you're accusing me of, he said quietly, and the quiet was worse than a shout. Brooke took a sip of her coffee. It was scalding, bitter, perfect. I'm not accusing you of anything, Doctor. I asked a procedural question about supply chain documentation. You're the one connecting dots. She walked past him before he could respond, her walk the same unhurried pace she'd used to cross hostile territory, the kind of gait that announced you were unafraid because you'd already survived worse than anyone in the room could inflict. Behind her, she heard Mercer's breathing accelerate, heard the scrape of his chair as he stood abruptly, heard the whispers beginning at the resident tables like wind through dry grass. He found her that afternoon in the supply closet on the 3rd floor, where she was restocking the crash cart with forceps and medication ampoules. He didn't knock. He stepped into the narrow space between the shelves and the door, blocking the only exit, his body language broadcasting something that went beyond professional anger. This was a man who had spent 2 years building a narrative of her incompetence, and she had just shattered it with a single sentence in front of witnesses. I'm going to have security escort you out of this hospital, Sullivan. His voice was tight, controlled, the voice of someone recalibrating after a miscalculation. You're a liability. You just accused me of fraud in front of half the nursing staff. That's defamation. That's grounds for immediate termination. Brooke didn't respond. She simply held his gaze, her jaw set so tight she could feel her teeth pressing together. The closet was small, maybe 8 feet by 6, and it smelled like antiseptic and cardboard. The fluorescent panel above them hummed its constant, indifferent frequency. She could hear the distant beeping of monitors in patient rooms beyond the walls, the sound of real work continuing regardless of whatever drama was unfolding in this concrete cave. She set down the 4 bags carefully, deliberately, and then she turned to face him fully. Not threatening. Not angry. Just present in a way that made it clear she was no longer interested in the performance. She brushed past him, her shoulder not quite touching his, but close enough that he had to step back or be moved, and walked out of the supply closet without a word. Behind her, she heard the fabric of his coat shift as he spun around, heard the explosive release of breath that came from a man whose usual tactics had failed to produce fear or submission. By the time she'd cleared the 3rd floor corridor and reached the stairwell, she knew he was already on his phone. She could feel the momentum shifting beneath her feet, the way it did before an operation spiraled from controlled to catastrophic. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 2:34 p.m. when the overhead intercom crackled with a voice that belonged to the charge nurse in trauma, code blue, Trauma Bay 3. All available personnel to trauma. Brooke was in the medication room, counting controlled substances for the shift change, when the announcement hit. Something in her chest tightened with a sensation that transcended simple clinical response. Trauma Bay 3 handled the critical GSWs, the blunt force traumas, the cases that separated the survivors from the statistics. She moved toward the door on reflex, her body already calibrated for crisis, her hands already beginning the unconscious checklist of what would be needed. The observation gallery outside Trauma Bay 3 was already crowded. She pushed through the ring of residents and nursing students, positioning herself where she could see through the observation window into the controlled chaos below. On the gurney lay a man in his mid-30s, Navy SEAL insignia still visible on the fragments of his combat shirt, multiple gunshot wounds, entry and exit, one wound track that had clearly compromised the thoracic cavity. The trauma team was working in that particular urgent precision that meant the patient was coding. And then she saw his face between the hands of the trauma surgeon performing chest compressions, and everything inside her froze. Hospital Corpsman Second Class Davies. The young medic who had qualified for her team after she'd been pulled from active duty. The kid she'd trained herself in the back corridors of Bagram, teaching him how to read a sucking chest wound, how to make decisions when plasma wasn't available and makeshift solutions meant the difference between a body bag and a medevac. The last person she'd seen before the Black Ops disaster that had erased her from every military database and sentenced her to this half-life in Raleigh. Her hands moved toward the door. Muscle memory was a force that transcended conscious intention. It was written in her nervous system, in the deep architecture of her bones. Davies was coding. Davies needed intervention. Davies needed hands that knew how to work inside a combat casualty. Then she saw Mercer standing inside the trauma bay, his arms crossed, watching the resuscitation with the cold focus of a man documenting evidence. The shock of it crystallized something in her chest. She froze mid-movement, her hand suspended halfway to the door handle. Around her, the residents and medical students were murmuring assessments of the case, running the clinical math out loud. The attending was calling for the thoracotomy tray, his voice uncertain. This was a procedure done in field conditions, not in civilian emergency departments, and the hesitation was audible in every word. Davies crashed again. The monitor flatlined with that sound that had no civilian equivalent, the sound of a heart surrendering. The attending's hand shook slightly as he reached for the scalpel, and Brooke watched it all through the thick glass of the observation window, her breathing shallow, her fingers forming themselves into fists without her permission. A Marine guard stood outside the trauma bay, his hand resting on his sidearm with the casual readiness of a man trained to kill in defense of his brothers. He was watching Davies with the intensity of someone looking at a mirror of himself, someone calculating what would be owed, what would require recompense. She couldn't move. She couldn't reveal herself. The Pentagon's orders were absolute: you don't exist, you never existed, you are legally dead in every way that matters. Surfacing now would compromise Davies worse than any GSW. It would expose him as connected to a phantom. It would bring questions that couldn't be answered, protocols that couldn't be explained, and security clearances that would shatter like old glass. So Brooke stood in the observation gallery at Cedar Creek Medical, watching a man she'd trained, a man whose life she'd once held in her hands in the dust outside Fallujah, fighting for his heartbeat while doctors tried to remember procedures they'd only read about in textbooks. And she did the only thing her training allowed her to do. She breathed. The overhead speaker crackled at 2:33 p.m. Code blue. Trauma Bay 3. Brooke's hands froze mid-restock of the med cart, a pack of 14-gauge angiocath needles suspended between her fingers. Her jaw tightened. Not the room number. Anything but that room. She set the needles down with mechanical precision and moved toward the trauma bays, her scrubs whispering against her thighs as she walked, every muscle remembering protocols her conscious mind had spent 2 years trying to forget. Through the observation window, she saw him immediately. Hospital Corpsman Second Class Davies. The young medic who had taken her place on the team after Bagram forced the Pentagon to erase Captain Brooke Sullivan from every database. His dark hair was matted with sweat. His right arm was wrapped in fresh gauze from what looked like a knife wound, deep and serious. She could read the injury from 20 feet away, penetrating trauma, probable arterial involvement, maybe 12 hours old. He'd been walking around with that wound for 12 hours before someone finally got him medical attention. The attending physician, Dr. Reeves, stood frozen at the instrument tray. His hands trembled as he stared at the surgical field. 30 seconds had passed since the monitor flatlined. 30 seconds of nothing. The attending reached for a thoracotomy tray, hesitated, then looked around the room as if the instruments might tell him what to do next. A nurse handed him sterile gloves. He fumbled getting them on. His fingers wouldn't cooperate. Around him, residents stood in a semicircle, watching, waiting for someone else to move first. The monitor alarm shrieked its flat, sustained note through the room, a sound like a fire alarm that never stopped, never changed, never offered mercy. 40 seconds. Brooke's hand was already on the observation window. The glass was cold. The hospital air smelled like antiseptic and fear, that particular cocktail of chemicals that appeared the moment death became possible. She could see Davies' pupils in the monitor feed above his head. Fixed. Dilated. 2 minutes without oxygen was 2 minutes too long. At 3 minutes, the brain began dying. At 4, it was dead. The clock wasn't moving backward. Dr. Mercer stepped closer to the surgical table. Not to help. Brooke knew the difference. She'd spent 2 years watching him move through Cedar Creek Medical with the predatory grace of a man who knew exactly where his power lay. He stepped to the instrument tray and planted himself there like a question mark. His presence made the space feel smaller. The attending looked up, expecting guidance. Instead, Mercer opened his mouth. "Who authorized this procedure?" His voice cut through the alarm like a blade. "Who is the attending of record?" Dr. Reeves blinked. I called it. He's in asystole. Protocol requires authorization from command, Mercer said flatly. This patient is Navy. That means his chain of command must authorize any intervention. Where is his command officer? The Marine guard standing at Davies' head went rigid. His hand moved toward his weapon, then stopped. His jaw clenched so hard Brooke could see the muscle flex from the observation window. 50 seconds. "Dr. Mercer," Reeves said, his voice shaking. "He's dying. We don't have time for chain of command calls. Then we don't have time for unsanctioned procedures." Mercer stepped directly in front of the tray, blocking Reeves' access to the thoracotomy instruments. "I need documentation. I need a note explaining who authorized you to proceed. I need." "His blood pressure is 0, a nurse said quietly. "We're at 60 seconds of asystole." Brooke's hands clenched into fists. The scars on her palms, old scars from shrapnel and fieldwork and holding dying men's hands in the dark, began to ache. She could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips. She could feel the weight of every decision she'd made to walk away from this, to become someone else, to be ordinary. Davies had taken her place. Davies was the one who was supposed to be alive. Davies was the one who trained under her and learned from her and carried forward the mission she'd abandoned. And now Davies was dying because a man with a grudge was protecting his reputation more carefully than he was protecting a life. "Stand aside," Reeves said, and there was something new in his voice. Something that sounded like command, like understanding that some rules dissolved the moment the patient flatlined. He reached for the thoracotomy tray. Mercer didn't move. "I'm documenting your violation of protocol. The hospital's risk management team will need to know that you proceeded without proper authorization, without consulting Naval Command, without." 70 seconds, the nurse said. Her voice had gone very small. The Marine guard's hand tightened on his weapon until his knuckles turned white. His eyes were fixed on Mercer with an intensity that said very clearly, "Take one more step and find out what happens." The silence in the trauma bay became the loudest thing in the room, louder than the alarm, louder than the monitor, louder than breath. Brooke could feel it pressing against the observation window. She could feel it pressing against her ribs. She was at the door. She didn't remember moving. Her hand was on the handle, and the handle was cold under her palm like metal in winter, like a trigger guard, like muscle memory asking the only question that mattered, would she let this happen? Mercer made eye contact with her through the window. His eyes were small and dark and satisfied. He shook his head very slowly, a signal clear as any order. Don't move. Don't speak. Don't do anything that would force him to destroy the cover story that had taken 2 years to build. Don't force his hand. Her entire body vibrated. Not with fear. With restraint. The difference between a scream and silence was just discipline. The difference between a nurse and a captain was just 2 years of practice at being less than she was. 80 seconds. The monitor maintained its flat, merciless tone. Davies' chest didn't move. His pupils didn't contract. In a few more seconds, the damage would become irreversible. The neurons would start dying. The man would become biological fact instead of living possibility. And Dr. Mercer would release a quiet statement about the unfortunate limitations of emergency medicine, about the importance of proper protocol, about how regrettable it was that not every patient could be saved. Brooke's jaw clenched so hard her teeth made contact with the soft tissue of her cheek. She could taste copper. Blood, or just the inside of her mouth, she couldn't tell anymore. Her military training had taught her that pain was information. That fear was data. That rage was fuel. But civilian life had taught her something else. Restraint was strength. Quiet could be louder than shouting. Walking away could be braver than staying. But watching Davies die was neither of those things. It was neither. The door handle felt like it was burning in her hand. The door handle burned in her hand. The moment stretched thin as wire. The attending physician stood frozen at the bedside, hands shaking, calling for authorization that would never come in time. The flatline alarm screamed its relentless song. Davies was gone. Or would be, in 45 seconds. Brooke didn't think. Thinking was a luxury for people with futures. She shoved through the trauma bay doors hard enough that both residents stumbled backward. The surgical theater erupted in surprised protest, a dozen voices talking at once, someone saying, "Excuse me, you can't be in here," but Brooke was already moving, and her voice dropped into the register she had buried 2 years ago. Not a request. A command. Scalpel. Rib spreaders. Clamp. Now. The attending turned, mouth opening to object, but something in her tone, something ancient and certain, the voice of someone who had ordered people to save lives under artillery fire, made him step aside instead. Mercer's face twisted with rage from the corner of the room, but she was already reaching for her ankle, fingers finding the combat knife taped to the inside of her calf, a habit from another life, a blade she wasn't supposed to have, a weapon she was about to use to save a man's life on an operating table in civilian North Carolina. The knife came free with a whisper of tape. The blade was 3 inches long, serrated at the base, sharp enough to split atoms. She didn't use the scalpel the resident offered. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory converting conscious thought into action the way it had in the surgical tent at Bagram 6 years ago. Left hand on Davies' chest to locate the intercostal space. Right hand steady as a surgical laser. The incision was one smooth motion, left lateral thoracotomy, 5th intercostal space, and the blade parted skin and muscle tissue with almost no resistance. Blood well dark and thin, oxygen depleted. Venous bleeding. Bad. The worst. Rib spreaders. Someone handed them to her. She positioned them with both hands, spreading the ribs apart to expose the pericardium. The sac surrounding his heart lay exposed, glistening, dead. She reached inside, her gloved fingers finding the slick muscle, and began manually massaging Davies' heart back to rhythm with the kind of pressure that would have seemed brutal to anyone who hadn't watched people die from hesitation. 30 seconds. Her fingers working. The monitor still flat. The room had gone completely silent, the kind of silence that comes right before someone screams. 60 seconds. She could feel the muscle responding under her touch, the stubborn biological refusal to die that she had felt in a dozen combat medics' chests, including the man whose heart she was holding right now. 90 seconds. The monitor blipped. Blipped again. The rhythm caught and held, irregular at first, then steadier, sinus rhythm climbing back from the dead. Davies's oxygen saturation began crawling upward, 42, 54, 67. His pupils reacted. His fingers twitched. She had called him back. Again. The observation windows were packed now, the entire hospital crowded around the glass, and applause erupted like a breaking wave, shocked, thunderous, the sound of people witnessing something that shouldn't have happened but did anyway. Nurses were crying. A surgical resident had his hand over his mouth. The attending physician looked like someone had just explained a miracle in medical terminology. Brooke didn't hear any of it. She was staring at Davies's face, at the chest she had just cracked open and saved, at the man who was still alive because she had been willing to cross every line that mattered. Her hands were shaking now, not from fear but from the weight of what she had just done, what she had just revealed, the way her muscle memory had risen up and worn her like a suit in front of every doctor and nurse in Cedar Creek Medical. That was when she saw Mercer's face. He stood in the corner of the trauma bay, his expression shifting from rage to calculation in the space of 2 heartbeats. His hand was already moving toward his phone. The small smile that crossed his face was the smile of a man who had just realized he was holding a weapon, and Brooke's stomach dropped because she recognized the look. She had seen it in the eyes of supply officers in Bagram who wanted to know why she questioned the inventory. She had seen it in the eyes of men who understood that information was more dangerous than blood. Within 30 minutes, she would learn the scope of what he had done. Within an hour, her entire life would detonate. Mercer left the trauma bay still on his phone. She overheard him in the hallway, his voice calm and precise, each word a blade. "Yes, I'm filing a formal complaint. Practicing outside her scope of practice. Violation of chain of command. Unsanctioned aggressive intervention without physician authorization." She heard him cite Joint Commission Regulation the 8th of March, 47 about unilateral procedural decisions. She heard him CC Hospital Administration, the State Nursing Board, Risk Management. She heard him invoke words like liability and reckless endangerment and investigation, building a paper trail thick enough to justify immediate termination. By the time she finished documenting Davies's vital signs and transfer to the ICU, security was waiting. The badge came off her neck. No discussion. No conversation. Just a young guard in a polo shirt who wouldn't meet her eyes, and the small plastic rectangle that had made her Brooke Sullivan, ER nurse, disappearing into his palm. The shift supervisor was apologetic but firm, administrative leave, effective immediately, pending investigation. Don't call. Don't contact other employees. Security will escort you to retrieve personal items. 11 o'clock at night. The locker room was deserted, fluorescent panels casting everything in the color of old bone. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air, the smell she had worn every shift for 2 years like a disguise. Brooke pulled her locker open. Inside was the second life she had constructed, a change of clothes, her street shoes, a phone she wasn't supposed to have, and the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining. The patch from her last deployment. The patch from the team that had made her what she was before the Pentagon erased her. She pulled off her scrubs slowly. The fabric was marked with Davies's blood, dark stains that told the story of what she had just done in that trauma bay. Every person in that hospital had watched her save a life with her hands. Every person in that hospital had seen the command in her movements, the authority in her voice, the muscle memory that didn't belong to an ordinary ER nurse. She had sacrificed her cover for a man who would never know who she really was. Davies would wake up in the ICU. He would see her in a hospital gown, pumped with painkillers and antibiotics, and he would remember that a female nurse had saved him. He would never connect the terrified person at the observation window to the woman who had performed combat medicine in front of the entire hospital. He would never know that the hand that had massaged his heart back to rhythm belonged to his captain, the person who had trained him in Bagram, the person the Pentagon had ordered to vanish. She folded the scrubs into a neat rectangle. The fabric still held warmth. She carried them to the hospital laundry bin and dropped them in with the other used linens, watching them disappear into the pile of contaminated material. A small gesture. Meaningless. It felt like burying evidence. She dressed in jeans and a grey jacket, the clothes of someone nobody noticed. She pulled her hair down from the surgical scrub. In the mirror above the sink, a stranger looked back, a woman without a badge, without a uniform, without the institutional identity that had protected her for 2 years. The employee exit was locked from the outside. She had to use her phone to unlock it, another artifact from another life, a device that had sat in a locker for 730 days without ringing. The night air hit her face cold and sharp. The parking lot was nearly empty. Rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier, and she didn't quicken her pace. She walked toward her car the way civilians walked, without the measured military stride that gave away everything. Somewhere in the hospital, Davies was waking up in the ICU. Somewhere in an administrative office, Mercer was building the case that would end her nursing career. Somewhere in the labyrinth of hospital systems, her identity was beginning to unravel. But in this moment, walking through cold Raleigh rain toward a car she had bought with cash 3 years ago, Brooke Sullivan was simply a woman who had crossed a line she could never uncross, and there was no going back to the life she had been living, because the mask had finally slipped, and everyone had seen the soldier underneath. She opened the car door. The interior smelled like old coffee and gun oil. She sat in the driver's seat with the door open, rain drumming against the hood, and did nothing for a long time. Her hand still remembered the feeling of Davies's heart beneath her fingers. Her hand still trembled with the weight of what she had chosen. 24 hours later, everything would change again. But for now, in the cold dark parking lot of Cedar Creek Medical, with no badge and no future, Brooke Sullivan simply sat and waited for her phone to ring. It would. Soon. The truth always had a way of finding you. 24 hours later, Brooke walked back into Cedar Creek Medical wearing jeans and a jacket, her badge no longer clipped to her collar. The parking lot smelled of rain-soaked asphalt and diesel exhaust from the ambulance bay. She'd come only for the paperwork, final paycheck, exit interview, the bureaucratic closing of a life she'd carefully constructed. 2 years of silence. 2 years of being invisible. 2 years of watching residents younger than her junior officers get praised while she kept her mouth shut and her hands steady. The ICU hallway was quieter than the trauma bay had been. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in that hospital white that made even healthy people look half dead. She was 3 steps from the administrative office when she heard the voice. Dr. Mercer. Of course. He stood outside Davies's ICU room with 3 hospital administrators clustered around him like pilot fish around a shark. His hands moved as he talked, gesturing as if conducting an orchestra. The recklessness was staggering, he was saying, his tone clinical, practiced. She had no authorization. No supervision. She performed a procedure that violated every protocol we have in place. The liability alone, he saw her and his smile widened, the kind of smile that comes right before the kill. Ah, Ms. Sullivan. Perfect timing. I was just explaining to administration how your actions last night constitute grounds for criminal negligence charges. Brooke stopped walking. The hallway seemed to compress around her, the walls moving inward like the sides of a coffin. 3 administrators turned to look at her with expression somewhere between pity and judgment. She'd learned to read those looks in every boardroom, every public space where people decided her worth based on what they saw, a woman in scrubs with scarred hands, nothing more. Just a nurse. Wrong place. Wrong time. Wrong judgment. That was when Davies woke up. The ICU room door was mostly closed, but the window gave her the view, Davies's eyes opening, finding the light, then finding her through the glass. His pupils dilated. His hand moved on the bed rail. And then his voice came, raspy from intubation tubes but sharp as broken glass, cutting through Mercer's monologue. Valkyrie. 1 word. That was all it took. The Marine Guard standing outside Davies's door, a lance corporal with the bearing of someone who'd seen actual combat, his entire posture changed. He came to attention. Not the slouch of a hospital security detail, but the precision snap of someone responding to a commanding officer. His hand went to Davies's personal effects on the bedside table. A jacket. Military issue. Old. The kind of thing you keep for 20 years and never throw away because it holds memories in its seams. The Marine's fingers found the lining and pulled it open. There. Sewn into the fabric with thread that had started to fray. A unit patch. Faded black and gold. The same symbol Brooke had worn on her own shoulder. The same one they'd all worn. The symbol of something that didn't exist anymore, a unit erased so completely that in official records, it had never been real. The Marine corporal pulled out a citation. He began to read. His voice was the voice of someone bearing witness to something sacred, formal, each word its own small ceremony. Captain Brooke Sullivan, United States Navy SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. The administrators shifted, confused. Mercer's smile faltered for the first time. For extraordinary heroism during classified operations in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. Citation recognized by the Department of Defense, Pentagon Records Division. Extraordinary heroism. The words hung in the hallway like something physical, something you could feel pressing against your sternum. Within the hour, a 2-star general walked out of the elevator at Cedar Creek Medical like a man who owned the building. General James Halloway, Fort Bragg liaison. His dress uniform was sharp enough to cut glass, and his face carried the kind of authority that made hospital administrators straighten their spines. He went directly to Brooke. Saluted her. Actually saluted her, fist to chest, the way you salute someone whose rank is higher than words. Mercer's face went the color of old snow. The general produced a decoration case. Inside, the Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. A purple heart. All the things Brooke had locked in a storage unit in Raleigh, the things she'd spent 2 years pretending didn't belong to her. He opened it so the administrators could see. So Davies could see from his hospital bed. So Mercer could see. The general spoke quietly, but his voice carried. Captain Sullivan is here in this hospital because someone ordered her to disappear. Black Ops. Classified. That order has been lifted as of this morning, effective immediately. Mercer tried to interrupt. His mouth opened. The procedures, the chain of command, the regulations. The regulations, the Pentagon liaison said, a woman with the bearing of someone who'd spent a career making men like Mercer disappear, require us to address the formal investigation Dr. Mercer himself demanded. She held up a folder. The thickness of it suggested something substantial. The audit of supply chain management here at Cedar Creek Medical. The one triggered by Captain Sullivan's questions about billing discrepancies 7 weeks ago. The liaison opened the folder. Papers. Spreadsheets. The kind of documentation that told a story if you knew how to read it. Systematic overbilling. $378,000 across 14 months. Kickback arrangements with MedSupply Corporation, surgical kits billed at triple the market rate but never opened. Insurance fraud across 42 patient accounts. She looked up from the page. All of it traceable to supply room anomalies first identified by Captain Sullivan in her inquiry. The same inquiry you threatened her over. The same week your campaign against her began. Mercer's hand started to shake. The liaison continued. The CEO of MedSupply Corp has already been contacted by federal authorities. Your arrangement with them has been documented. Hospital administration is being notified. Your credentials are under immediate review by the State Medical Board. Security was called. Not the hospital security Brooke had seen escort other people out. Real security. Serious. She watched Mercer's badge get clipped off his collar, the same badge that had terrified her in the ER. She watched his hand shake as he was led past her, past the general still standing at attention, past Davies watching from his window with eyes that had seen something in her that no one else had ever bothered to look for. Inside Davies's room, after the administrators and the liaison had given them space, the story came apart and reformed itself into something that made sense. Davies was bandaged across his left side, his breathing still assisted by oxygen cannulas, but his voice was getting stronger with each word. 12 of us made it out of San Juan Valley because of her, he said to the general. She trained me personally. The thoracotomy technique she used on me in that trauma bay, I learned it from her. She was the best combat medic I've ever served with. And then they erased her. Made her disappear. The general nodded. He understood. That was what this uniform meant. Sometimes the country asked you to become a ghost. Brooke stood at the window, looking at the chart in her hands. Davies' vitals. His recovery trajectory. Clear signs that the thoracotomy had worked, that his heart had taken the rhythm it needed. The same hand movements that had pulled him back from the edge. The same muscle memory that had cost her everything. The CEO of Cedar Creek Medical appeared in the hallway with legal counsel flanking him like armor. "Captain Sullivan," he said, and the word captain landed like a punch. "We would like to offer immediate reinstatement to your position. Promotion to clinical supervisor. A formal apology for Dr. Mercer's conduct. Whatever you need." She looked at the chart. At Davies. At the general, who was now looking at her the way a commander looks at a soldier who's proven herself in fire. She asked the question that mattered. "Can I see his full chart?" The doctor handed it over without hesitation. 6 months later, Brooke stood in dress uniform at Davies' promotion ceremony at Fort Bragg. The decorations she'd locked away were pinned to her chest, the Navy Cross beneath everything, the way it should be. She watched Davies accept his new rank, watched him smile at her from across the parade ground. The promotion of a man who'd learned everything from a woman who wasn't supposed to exist. After the ceremony, after the photographs, after the official acknowledgement, she drove back to Raleigh. Cedar Creek Medical's parking lot was the same as it always was, an expanse of asphalt baking in the Carolina heat, ambulances coming and going like a mechanical heartbeat. She was walking toward the entrance when she saw the van. Med Supply Corporation. The logo was printed on the side in corporate blue. In the driver's seat, hands gripping boxes with the familiar packaging of surgical kits, was Dr. Mercer. He wore a company uniform now, gray and nondescript, the kind of thing a delivery driver wore. Loading boxes. The same boxes that had made him wealthy. The same boxes that had nearly destroyed a career to cover them up. Their eyes met across the parking lot. Brooke gave him the stare she'd given him in the supply closet weeks ago. Flat. Cold. Glacial. The kind of stare that came from someone who'd looked across battlefields at enemies and decided their worth with complete certainty. She held it for 3 seconds. Didn't blink. Didn't speak. Then she walked past him. Inside Cedar Creek Medical, the main lobby had been renovated. New paint. New lighting. And on the wall, mounted in a glass case, was her Navy Cross. Beneath it, a plaque in brushed steel read, "Captain Brooke Sullivan, USN," when others would not. Through the window behind the display, visible in the hospital's training center, Brooke taught a new generation of combat medics. Young corpsmen in full uniform sat at the table, hanging on every word. She demonstrated the technique, the hand position for manual cardiac massage, the pressure points, the rhythm that mimics what the heart should do when it forgets how to beat. The same hand movements that had brought Davies back. The same movements she'd been told to hide. A young lance corporal raised his hand. "Captain, how did you develop such precise technique?" She looked at him. At all of them. Hands that would go on to save lives on battlefields and in hospitals and in the seconds between death and survival. "Practice," she said. And the understanding that sometimes the difference between living and dying comes down to whether someone's willing to do what everyone else is too afraid to do. The corpsman nodded. Wrote it down. They all did. And somewhere in that moment, watching the next generation carry forward what she'd spent 2 years hiding, Brooke Sullivan understood that some missions don't end when you come home. Some missions just change uniforms. If you ever doubted that heroes walk among us, that they work in hospitals and classrooms and the quiet moments when no one's watching, this is why. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because these stories don't find you. You have to seek them out. Drop a comment and tell us, would you have revealed your secret to save someone, or would you have let the cover hold? The answer says everything about who you are.